There was a scene on a ship that made people fall completely silent, because in that moment, Diane Lane no longer seemed to be acting, but rather shedding her glamorous shell, revealing a soul so raw it took your breath away. Yet she simply smiled and whispered, "It was nothing." A response as light as air. But in truth, it was the mask Diane had worn her entire life to conceal wounds that never truly healed. At 14, she graced the cover of Time magazine. At 18, she became a millionaire, a teen icon so captivating Hollywood could not look away. But the brighter she shone, the quieter she became, never defending, never denying. And not until the age of 59 did she finally confirm what had long been whispered. Her secret relationships with Timothy Hutton and Christopher Atkins. A fleeting confession, yet powerful enough to awaken an entire past buried in silence. Join us as we uncover a chapter of Diane Lane's life that has never been told, because what truly happened to her is far more heartbreaking than anyone ever imagined. Before the world knew her as the graceful, magnetic star of Hollywood, before she graced the cover of Time magazine at just 14 and captivated audiences with her soulful eyes, there was a little girl whose life began not with love, but with a fracture. Diane Lane's story does not begin with applause. It begins with silence, with loss, with a deep and aching loneliness that no child should ever have to carry. Her earliest memories weren't of lullabies or bedtime stories, but of suitcases, shifting hotel rooms, and a father's worn-out taxi tracing endless loops through Manhattan nights. She didn't grow up in a home. She grew up in transit, between moments, inside gaps that love never managed to fill. In a truly heartbreaking reality, Diane Lane was born on January 22, 1965, in New York City, but not into the warm embrace of a whole family. Just 13 days after her birth, her parents' marriage had already crumbled. Her mother, Colleen Lee Farrington, a lounge singer and a former Playboy Miss October, soon moved to Mexico, keeping Diane with her until the age of 6. Then, with quiet finality, she handed Diane over to her father. Her father, Burton Eugene Lane, was an acting coach, once involved in a theater workshop with John Cassavetes, and a man of many trades, from driving a taxi to teaching humanities at City College. But as a father, he brought no stability. Diane's childhood was marked by constant movement, cheap hotels, fleeting addresses, and nights spent riding in the back of a cab. There was no steady school, no familiar bed, no place to call home. Her childhood smelled of city pavement, glowed under the blur of yellow streetlights, and echoed with monologues rehearsed in empty rooms. She didn't grow up in a family. She grew up inside unfinished scenes. With no one to catch her when she fell, Diane learned early how to survive alone. At just 15, she made the unthinkable decision to separate legally from her father, a tragic but necessary move to reclaim control over a life that never truly felt like her own. Not long after, she flew to Los Angeles with co-star Christopher Atkins for a film promotion. No chaperones, no plans, no map. Later, she would call it a reckless act by a girl who had too much freedom, too young. Returning to New York, she moved in with a friend's family, paid rent, and completed high school through correspondence. At 16, Diane was living like an adult. No guidance, no protection, no safety net. But perhaps the most jarring and cruel moment of her youth came in 1981, when her mother, long absent, suddenly reappeared and whisked her away from New York without warning. A legal battle followed. 6 weeks later, Diane returned, but not as a reconciled daughter. She returned with a wound that would remain invisible yet unhealed. She did not speak to her mother for the next 3 years. Strangely, the place she had been taken against her will, Georgia, became the only place where she would ever feel some measure of peace. Living with her Pentecostal grandmother, she found solace in simple routines, eating salted meat with butter, repairing lawn mowers, disappearing into quiet corners of small-town life. Diane Lane's childhood wasn't stolen, it was never given. She wasn't raised in love, she was sculpted in silence. And she endured it not with defiance, but with the quiet resilience of someone who had no other choice. But sometimes, the world mistakes survival for strength. Diane didn't rise from childhood, she escaped it. And just when she thought she could breathe, another kind of storm arrived. Not of pain, but of praise. Not rejection, but recognition. A spotlight that looked like salvation, but felt like another kind of cage. It's heartbreaking how quickly a child's face became a brand and her soul forgotten. Success first found Diane Lane not as a gift, but as a spotlight, too blinding for a young soul still learning how to exist. At just 13, she wasn't eased into stardom. She was thrown into it, sharing the screen not with peers, but with legends. In A Little Romance, 1979, opposite Laurence Olivier, Diane didn't act like a child learning lines. She moved like someone born from heartache. Each glance she offered carried the ache of someone much older, as if life had already whispered its secrets into her ears. By 14, she was not just noticed. She was immortalized on the cover of Time magazine under the label Hollywood's Whiz Kid. But what looked like a triumph to the world was, for her, the beginning of confinement. She was cast not in a role, but in an image, brilliant, pure, flawless. There was no space left for error, no room to be messy, awkward, or human. Hollywood didn't give her success. It gave her a frame and demanded she never step outside it. Roles came like crashing waves, not lifting her, but eroding her edges. Touched by Love, Six Pack, and then the tidal force of Coppola's The Outsiders, Rumble Fish, The Cotton Club. He saw talent. Others saw a formula. Diane had become an emblem, a fantasy in motion, sculpted to please and never to question. She was the love interest, always. The beautiful ideal men longed for, regardless of plot, partner, or purpose. No one asked her what stories she wished to tell, only that she stay exactly as the world first adored her. At 18, she was rich, but not free. The world had created a version of Diane so beloved, even she had trouble recognizing herself outside it. The media fed the myth. Matt Dillon, Michael Pare, Richard Gere, names attached to hers without confirmation because in silence, the fiction thrived. She once said, "Just because I play someone's lover on screen doesn't mean I love them in real life." But her voice was drowned beneath the roar of expectations. So cruel, to be celebrated only when pretending to be someone else. Diane wasn't seen as a person. She was remembered as feelings people projected onto her. Tenderness, desire, youth. And maybe, slowly, she forgot to remember who she truly was. When a name is replaced by a symbol, what remains is performance without pause, beauty without breath, motion without meaning. Her success didn't nurture. It preserved. Like an insect encased in glass, perfect but paralyzed. The light that followed her didn't warm. It exposed. It scanned every gesture, flattened every nuance, and erased anything that didn't match the fantasy. What wrapped around Diane wasn't admiration. It was a labyrinth built of admiration's shadow. It glittered like crystal, but every path led her back to the same reflection. The girl with soft eyes, the lovely smile, the flawless femininity meant to be adored, but never truly understood. No one asked if she was lonely. No one asked if she wanted to stop. They only asked that she remain, timeless, untouchable, unchanged. The flashes of cameras no longer felt like celebration, but surveillance. Every spotlight, a silent prison. Every red carpet, a sentence without appeal. Diane, once hailed as a breath of fresh air, became a ghost inside the very stories that made her famous. Still breathing, still standing, but no longer writing her own script, just reciting lines written by a world that never asked who she wanted to become. In Hollywood, love stories often end in headlines, loud, messy, sensational. But Diane Lane lived through love in quieter ways, more complex, more dignified, and far more heartbreaking than the public could ever imagine. In 1984, at the peak of her stardom, Diane met French actor Christopher Lambert in Paris. She was America's radiant promise. He was a European icon. Their connection didn't spark in chaos. It bloomed in stillness, the kind of stillness where two souls quietly recognize one another. 4 years later, they married, and in 1993, their daughter Eleanor was born, a child Diane would later call the guiding light behind every decision in my life. But even light can flicker, and sometimes even love runs out of road. It was the longest relationship Diane ever had, but it was also the one that taught her the raw truth. Sometimes, love alone isn't enough to make someone stay. There was no betrayal, no cruel ending. Just silence that grew louder, distance that widened like a crack in glass, and two lives pulled apart by demands, careers, and quiet incompatibilities. In 1994, after 6 years, they divorced. Not with drama, not with war, but with a kind of aching calm. Diane never spoke badly of Lambert. She didn't need to. All she ever said was enough to crush a heart. We truly loved each other, but sometimes love just isn't enough. Yet, even after the goodbye, they didn't burn the bridge. They stood on it, side by side as co-parents, raising Eleanor with unwavering respect. In an industry obsessed with chaos, theirs was a rare act of grace. For Diane, it wasn't just an ending. It was proof that sometimes the bravest way to love is to let go without bitterness. And the strongest goodbye is the one spoken in peace. Nearly a decade after letting go of her first great love, Diane Lane allowed her heart to wander beyond its scars once more. This time, it found its way to Josh Brolin, a man whose intensity mirrored her own, whose mystery felt like a challenge, and whose charm carried the kind of danger that could be mistaken for depth. To the world, their 2004 marriage looked like fate. Two seasoned actors, weathered by life, finally finding a match that felt equal. But behind the smiles and red carpets, something unraveled. Just 4 months in, the illusion shattered in one silent scream. One night, details still unspoken, Diane picked up the phone with trembling hands and called the police. Josh was arrested on allegations of domestic violence. The headlines didn't wait. They exploded. Diane Lane, assaulted, echoing across tabloids and news screens like shrapnel. Photos were twisted into stories. Silence was filled with speculation. And Diane was dragged into a narrative she never agreed to tell. But through it all, she said nothing. No statement, no talk show, no side taken. Her silence was louder than any denial, because it wasn't about clearing her name, it was about protecting something deeper. Her peace. From that moment, Diane vanished from the spotlight, not as a retreat, but as an act of quiet rebellion. She became a mother, a woman stitching invisible wounds behind closed doors, away from flashbulbs and gossip. The marriage lingered for years, a hushed existence with no curtain calls. Then, in 2013, without bitterness or spectacle, she filed for divorce. No blame, no lawsuit, just the final line in a script she never asked to star in. If her first love ended in quiet respect, this one left no bruises the world could see. But the scars were there, etched in the spaces where her voice used to speak. Yet she never played the victim. She didn't need to. Because in walking away, in choosing silence over spectacle, Diane Lane made her boldest statement. That dignity is not something the world gives you. It's something you choose to keep, even when everything else has been taken. After 2 failed marriages, Diane Lane no longer sought grand declarations under the spotlight, nor did she yearn for a love that was loud and complete. She wasn't looking for someone to fill the voids. She simply hoped to touch understanding, even if only for a moment. The men who passed through her life thereafter bore no titles of husband, no wedding rings, no promises, but each left a silent, piercing mark. They didn't enter her life to stay, but their presence, even fleeting, was enough to stir emotions she thought had long been dormant. John Bon Jovi was the first to bring that feeling. In 1985, they were together for a brief period, but it was enough to etch into her memory a different image. A man who saw her not as a star, but as a real person. When that relationship ended gently, Diane didn't collapse. But from then on, her life became a series of unfinished romances, almosts, nearlies, small flames that extinguished before they could blaze. Matthew McConaughey came later, in 2019's Serenity. Their on-screen chemistry was undeniable, but behind the scenes, another kind of spark quietly ignited. Matthew confessed that he had a childhood crush on Diane. She laughed, gently deflecting, but deep in her eyes, there was a glimmer of emotion. In a world that had taken so much from her, such a sincere confession, however brief, was enough to warm the lonely corners of her heart. And then there was Richard Gere, not just a co-star, but a mirror reflecting a part of her soul. They first met in the Cotton Club, 1984, when Diane was still very young, and their connection had smoldered since then. Nearly 2 decades later, in Unfaithful, 2002, and Nights in Rodantha, 2008, they reunited on screen, portraying couples full of torment and regret. No scandals, no confirmed love, just such harmony that audiences couldn't help but believe there was something between them. But perhaps it was the very lack of consummation that made their bond so haunting. Not love, but a silent, complete, and wordless understanding. 3 men, 3 fragments in a life marked by silent heartbreak. None of them stayed to walk her home through the years, but each left behind a quiet echo, like the final note of a love song that never found its chorus. Diane Lane never called them unfinished loves. To her, they were awakenings, moments when her heart flickered back to life, however briefly, in a world that had taken so much. And perhaps that's why they lingered, not for what they were, but for what they almost became. Because sometimes it's the love that never fully arrives that leaves the deepest mark. There are performers who step onto the stage, and then there is Diane Lane, an artist who walks through fire and lets the ash become her script. After years spent weathering the quiet storms of her own life, she didn't return to the screen with fanfare. She returned like a slow, rising tide that whispered rather than roared, and yet left nothing untouched. No longer the teen idol frozen on magazine covers, she emerged as a vessel for the quiet wreckage women carry, those who aren't asking to be saved, just understood. In 2002, she gave us Connie in Unfaithful, a woman not driven by lust, but by loneliness so deep it made her invisible in her own marriage. The scene on the train, hands trembling, breath fractured, soul unspooling without a single word, was never in the script. The director only said, "Roll," and Diane did what no lines could. She let her heartbreak speak. One take, no rehearsal. And in that aching stillness, she earned not just an Oscar nomination, but the right to never be underestimated again. A year later, she became Frances in Under the Tuscan Sun, a woman fleeing not betrayal, but the silence after love dies. She wasn't searching for romance. She was trying to remember her own name. Diane later revealed that filming in Italy felt like paradise that curdled. After 5 weeks, she missed her daughter so much, she cried between scenes, the beauty around her only deepening her ache. That loneliness she carried into every hesitant step Frances took, turning a postcard-perfect setting into a quiet elegy. But this wasn't her first whisper of reinvention. Back in 1999, A Walk on the Moon saw her as a wife drifting in a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like a locked room. No yelling, no betrayal. Just the slow, crushing realization that she no longer recognized at the reflection in her husband's eyes. That was Diane's gift, to let an audience feel the absence of words as loudly as a scream. In Secretariat, 2010, she transformed into Penny Chenery, a woman the world doubted because she didn't shout, didn't stomp, didn't quit. Instead, she stood alone in a male-dominated arena, not demanding to be believed, but daring to believe in herself. In Trumbo, 2015, she wore the silence of a blacklisted screenwriter's wife like armor. Never complaining, never retreating, simply holding the home like it was the last thing still standing. And in Nights in Rodantha, 2008, reuniting with Richard Gere, she no longer played the young beauty. They were two fractured souls learning to touch again. The glances, the pauses, the weight of every breath. It wasn't performance. It was lived-in ache. By then, Diane Lane had stopped playing roles. She became a canvas for the grief women carry, for the strength built in silence, for the scars that never scream but always shine. She didn't repeat characters. Each one was carved from a different wound. And every time she stepped onto the screen, Diane didn't just act. She offered the last unspoken piece of herself, letting her own brokenness bloom into something unforgettable. As the years moved forward, Diane Lane didn't chase relevance. She let it find her, in roles that no longer needed youth or glamour, but truth. Her characters weren't about perfection, but quiet strength. Women who lived in silence, yet still stood tall. In Extrapolations, 2023, she portrayed Martha Russell, navigating a world collapsing under climate change. Fragile, but unwavering. Then came Feud, Capote vs. the Swans, 2024, where Diane embodied Slim Keith, elegant, wounded, and betrayed. She didn't scream. She smoldered, and that silence earned her an Emmy nomination. In A Man in Full the same year, she became Martha Croker, a steel-hearted woman in a crumbling empire. She didn't steal scenes, she anchored them. And in Anniversary, 2025, she returns as Ellen in a psychological thriller, stepping into darkness with dignity. These weren't just roles, they were reflections. Diane wasn't acting youth anymore. She was embodying truth. Each woman she portrayed felt lived in, bruised but breathing. And through them, Diane Lane reminded us that sometimes the most powerful stories come not from those who shout, but from those who endure and refuse to fade. Diane Lane never lived to make noise. She lived to be real, and that very truth is what makes her unforgettable. When the screen fades to black, Diane doesn't turn to social media to share her thoughts. No parties, no shocking sound bites. She lives slowly, privately, as if every step she takes is intentional. Morning yoga, weekend horseback rides, flower arranging, gardening, collecting antiques, and quietly walking down the street, like an anonymous woman in a world obsessed with shouted names. Her home in Los Angeles isn't a palace of glitz. It's a sanctuary of silence and sunlight, surrounded by carefully tended gardens and rooms filled with books, not trophies. Now, in her early 60s, she has no need to shout, no desire to impress. She never remarried after her divorce from Josh Brolin, not because she gave up on love, but because she no longer needed it to define her. She once said, "Peace is underrated." And that seems to be what she's chosen now. Not another romance to repair what's broken, but stillness to honor what's whole. Diane remains close to her daughter Eleanor, her greatest love, her quiet legacy. Eleanor, now grown and walking her own path, still calls her mother her rock. And behind closed doors, they laugh, they cry, they live, not for the world, but for each other. Diane once shared that during Eleanor's teen years, she would embarrass her on purpose, just to see her smile. It wasn't just motherhood, it was healing wrapped in love. She has quietly returned to the screen in roles that reflect her age, wisdom, and experience, not glamorized, but human. In Feud, Capote versus the Swans, 2024, she smoldered in silence as Slim Keith, earning an Emmy nomination. In A Man in Full, 2024, she became Martha Croker, a steel-spined woman in a crumbling empire. In the upcoming thriller Anniversary, 2025, she plays Ellen, a mother caught in the terrifying fracture of a family torn apart by a new movement. And once again, she lent her voice to motherhood in Inside Out 2, reminding audiences of emotional depth with only a whisper. These weren't performances, they were quiet revelations. And when she's not acting, she gives her time to causes close to her heart. She recently attended the Skin Cancer Foundation's Champions for Change Gala, not as a star, but as an advocate. Her voice isn't loud, but it's clear, and it matters. Her health, strong, her heart, open. She eats simply, she lives gently. No surgeries, no masks, just the lines of a life fully lived and proudly worn. She doesn't long for youth. She calls aging a privilege. She doesn't work to be seen. She works to stay alive, to stay connected to something deeper. Her legacy isn't in statues, ratings, or red carpets. It's in the quiet trust we place in her, the ache we feel when she cries, the silence we honor when she disappears from view. And now, to truly understand Diane Lane's journey, we can't just look at the spotlight or the glittering success. We have to look back to the little girl who grew up in rundown hotels, riding through the streets of Manhattan in her father's taxi. No home, no school. A child who legally emancipated herself, stepping into the world with no guide to follow. We have to see the woman who was pushed into roles others wanted her to play, only to quietly rediscover herself through the fractures of her own life. And after all the challenges, all the silent heartbreak, Diane Lane rose. Not to be applauded, but to live a life that was truly her own. No noise, no applause. She simply lived, quietly, simply, but with unmistakable dignity. And from that stillness, she left behind something priceless. A life not lived to please the world, but to stay honest with herself. And you? Do you have the courage to choose a life like hers, imperfect, but free and true? Are you willing to walk through the trials and learn to love yourself again, just as Diane Lane did?